This is the Didarganj Yakshi, or the Stri Ratna, the oldest life-size statue discovered in India so far. It is more than 2,000 years old. For many years, the statue was half submerged in the Ganga, and the back of the lady was used by washermen to beat their clothes clean. This statue and many other reminders of the glorious Mauryan period during the 4th to the 2nd century before Christ were chiseled painstakingly from sandstone quarried at Chunar near Varanasi. Chunar stone is still used to carve massive sculptures, using iron tools similar to those used by Mauryan craftsmen. The lion capital on the pillar erected at Sarnath by the Emperor Ashoka was discovered as late as 1904. Barely 45 years later, but more than 2,000 years after his time, it was adopted as the symbol of modern Republican India.
There was the subconscious notion that it was during the period of Ashoka's reign that you had the Indian subcontinent brought under a single political unity, virtually. This was the only time it happened, and after that it was when the subcontinent became British India. So I think that was a subconscious strand in making a kind of parallel or an analogy. But consciously and overtly, I think there was a lot of intention in picking up these symbols to suggest, yes, that the new rule was now going to be a rule that was righteous, that was ethical, that had all these inbuilt ideas of the importance of social responsibility.
These were also the years when India had just gained independence, and the new rulers of India needed role models. A legendary king from Indian history was required, even in the face of insufficient evidence. Modern India needed Ashoka the Great, and greatness was thrust upon him. But was Ashoka great in his own time? For an answer to that question, and many others, we have to travel further back in time. What were Ashoka's antecedents, and where does his own history begin?
The Shatapath Brahman tells the story of the eastward migration of the people who got to be known as the Aryans. These people at that time used to live somewhere in the Punjab or UP, areas which were known as Brahmavart or Aryavart. They moved eastwards, and along with them moved Agni, the fire god. Agni blessed the land as they went along. In other words, they cleared the forests by burning. And so they proceeded eastwards, crossing many small rivers. Finally, they came to the river Sadanira. Sadanira means the river which always is full of water. That is today's Gandak. And there, Agni refused to cross over to the left bank. This tale again is that on the other side of the river, the forests were so dense that they could not be cleared by burning. What was required was the use of iron axes and the ploughing of land with iron ploughs.
The eastward progress of the people who spoke Indo-Aryan languages became dependent upon access to iron, and so did the formation of states and empires. The Iron Age, Kali Yuga, began. With the use of this metal, life became qualitatively different from the earlier period when tools were made either of stone or of copper and its alloys. The Iron Age saw a new strength in tools. It became possible not only to cut trees and to plow the land deep, but also to kill, much more effectively than ever before. Warfare and empire building became possible, and iron provided the frame on which the might of Magadha was erected. The first empire that grew in India was in Magadha in the 6th century before Christ. It is not coincidental that the capital of this empire was at Rajgir, which stands at the meeting point of the agriculturally rich Gangetic Plains and the mineral-rich Jharkhand Plateau. Surrounded by a cyclopean wall, Rajgir was the vantage point of the Magadhan kings, some of whom belonged to the semi-tribal Shishunag dynasty. The Swarna Bhandar at Rajgir is said to be the treasury of King Bimbisar, who befriended both the Buddha and Mahavir the Jain. It was from Rajgir that Bimbisar's son, the mighty King Ajatashatru, expanded India's first historical empire. He carried out a coup d'etat against his father Bimbisar and imprisoned him here, and so became the first in a long line of illustrious Indian rulers who imprisoned their fathers, going counter to the popular misconception of filial devotion among Indians. Ajatashatru expanded the empire by conquering the neighboring Janapads like the Lichavi Republic of Vaishali.
When Ajatashatru had consolidated his hold over Magadha, he decided to conquer Vaishali. The reason why he had to do so was because on his east, the kingdom of Ang had already been conquered by his father Bimbisar. Bang or Bengal was still wild territory, and it was left to Ashok much later to go and conquer Kalinga, which is modern day Orissa. Meanwhile, on the southern bank of the Ganga, he set up a fort. This fort became the nucleus around which the town of Patliputra later grew up.
Pataliputra, today's Patna, became the focal point of the empire in subsequent periods. The ruins of that imperial capital, with this 80-pillared Mauryan hall in the Kumrar locality of Patna, tell an eloquent tale.
When Ajatashatru founded the city of Patliputra, he is supposed to have invited the Buddha to bless it. The Buddha indeed passed through the city, but warned it of 3 possible dangers. Fire, flood, and endemic feud, he said, would affect its citizens. Since the city was built largely of wood, and even now many of its houses are covered with thatched roofs, the city saw many devastating fires. As for internal feuds, it has been an endemic feature of the population of Bihar in general and of the citizens of Patna in particular. And waters still cover the 80-pillared hall where Chandragupta Maurya and Ashok held court. This hall was described by Megasthenes, who was the Greek ambassador to the court of the Mauryas, as magnificent. Today, one little stump of a pillar and another pillar lying on its side are all that is visible.
It was during the period of Magadhan expansion that Alexander invaded the northwestern part of India. However, even the formidable forces of Alexander preferred to withdraw from the Indian subcontinent rather than risk a confrontation with the mighty armies of the Magadhan Nanda kings. The might of the Magadhan Empire, based on relatively easy access to iron, was augmented by Chandragupta Maurya. He took over the Magadhan kingdom from the Nandas, expanded it and administered it as a centralized system. After a full life as warrior and king, Chandragupta abdicated his throne to become a Jain monk. He is said to have ended his life through acute renunciation and voluntary starvation at Shravanabelagola, the site of the Bahubali's Jain statue at Gomateshwar.
Namo Airyanam, Namo Uvajjayanam, Namo Lohe Savvasahunam, Om Namo Arhantanam, Namo Siddhanam, Namo Airyanam, Namo Uvajjayanam.
Chandragupta's son, Bindusar, we are told, conquered the land between the two seas, presumably the peninsula between the Arabian Sea and the Bay of Bengal. Early Tamil Sangam poets sang of Mauryan war chariots thundering across the land. In the 3rd century before Christ, Chandragupta Maurya's grandson, Ashoka, inherited that vast empire. But there was one gap, Kalinga, and the areas inhabited by the forest peoples, the Artavikas, were not entirely subjugated. The best known fact about Ashoka's rule is that he invaded Kalinga. Why was Kalinga so important that it had to be conquered by Ashoka?
The iron-bearing areas lay between Magadha and Kalinga. The only thing is that there hasn't been enough exploration archaeologically of the iron-bearing areas, and we don't know whether they were worked during the Mauryan period. Iron really becomes one resource among a large number, and in a sense that's the major difference as far as the technology and economy of the Mauryan period is concerned, that the resources are much more varied and range over all kinds of activities and products.
The Mauryan army that invaded Kalinga was stationed very near the place where the Danapur cantonment stands today. Greek chroniclers estimated that the Mauryan army comprised 9,000 elephants, 30,000 cavalry, and 600,000 infantry. Such a large army could have gone to Odisha through two possible routes from its base. It could have taken the cumbersome riverine and coastal route to Kalinga. Alternatively, it could have taken what is known as the pilgrim route between Gaya in Magadha and Puri in Kalinga. It is not coincidental that the pilgrim route passes through the tribal Jharkhand territories which abound in minerals like iron. And in this respect, the conquest of Kalinga could also have been the conquest of further sources of iron. By the time Ashoka ruled over the Magadhan Empire, the surface deposits of iron, available from scattered meteorites since the time of Ajatashatru and even earlier, were getting scarce. However, huge supplies of the ore were available in the territories of the tribals who had developed technologies of smelting and working the metal. We know that Ashoka's armies fought a bloody battle on the plains of Odisha near today's Bhubaneswar. Hundreds of thousands perished in that war. These are large numbers even today. They were enormous more than 2,000 years ago. Horrified by the sufferings he had caused, Ashoka repented. He found solace in the righteous middle path of the Buddha. 4 years after the Battle of Kalinga, Ashoka embraced Buddhism at Sanchi. He also had the principles of his kingship engraved on pillars and rocks throughout his empire. But there is more to Ashoka's policy than just that. The empire continued to grow, and a major aspect of that expansion was through the extension of cultivation using iron plows in the crown lands which the Arthashastra calls Sita. The use of the term Sita recalls the significant Ramayana story of the Videha king Janak, the father, ploughing virgin land and Sita emerging from it.
Ashoka doesn't refer to the Kalinga war in the Dholi inscription. However, he has other references to it in other inscriptions. And the most significant part in that are the numbers of people that he refers to. 150,000 dead, many more died outside battle out of injuries, and about 100,000 or 150,000 deported. The most significant is the deported. Who were these and where were they deported to? These were the people who were caught after the battle and sent off to cultivate the uncultivated lands, the Sita lands, the crown lands, which provided the king with immense sources of revenue. Mind you, this was the period when extension of cultivation was still going on.
After the war, even as a follower of the Buddha, Ashoka continued to aspire to be a Chakravarti Raja.
In the Buddhist concept of kingship, there is a lot of emphasis on the notion of the Chakravarti. And the Chakravarti in the Buddhist concept is not the great conqueror so much as the person in whose reign the wheel of law revolves right through his territory.
Ashoka proclaimed the principles of his rule through two types of edicts in the local dialects and languages of the different parts of his vast empire. The first type comprises the inscriptions on majestic pillars which lay down motherhood principles like truth, non-violence and eco-friendliness to the mainstream population in a gentle, persuasive tone. The other edicts, carved on rude rocks, are addressed to the Artivikas, the tribals, and adopt a very different tone. Forget not that the beloved of the gods, in addition to being righteous, is also powerful.
The element of Ashoka's non-violence has perhaps been overemphasized unduly, in the sense that he certainly says that he doesn't wish to conquer anymore, that he wishes people to be persuaded to adopt the kinds of ideas that he is suggesting they should, and so on. But he doesn't actually say that he's going to give up using force. And in fact, he does say in one of his edicts that if my sons and grandsons have to use force, then may they be merciful in their punishments and, you know, in other words, use it cautiously. It's mentioned in the context of the people of the forest, so one assumes that it's addressed to that kind of society.
There's one very interesting rule which Ashoka lays down for the royal household in the set of these inscriptions. He says that in the king's household, a large number of animals used to be killed for food. And he says nowadays only 2 animals are killed, 2 peacocks and 1 deer, and the deer not every day. And he says in the future, even these animals will not be killed. Why the peacocks? Remember that the dynasty to which Ashoka belonged was called the Maurya, and the totemic symbol of the Mauryas was the Moor, the peacock. Therefore, it was important for the Mauryas to kill and eat peacocks. So even after he becomes a Buddhist in a way and gives up violence, he still continues with this little practice, which is a tribal practice. But then, one set of animals who could have benefited from royal clemency, Ashoka does not prohibit their killing, and that is, as Kosambi says, the featherless bipeds, human beings. Human beings are still executed. Capital punishment is continued even after Ashoka gives up violence.
Indeed, the evolving relationship between the tribes and the non-tribals has been a continuous strand in Indian history. In the Mahabharata, the Pandavas burnt Khandav to clear the lands of the Nagas, a generic name for the tribes. Ashoka conquered Kalinga. Akbar's troops carried out incursions into Jharkhand, and the British attempted to tightly control tribal areas immensely rich in natural resources. The process of integration of the tribes into the general Indian society of which the reign of Ashoka was one of the landmarks, goes on even today. That the process remained inconclusive is evidenced by the fact that shortly after the collapse of the Mauryan Empire, Ashoka's legacy of righteous rule disappeared. Even the memory of the righteous monarch, whose combination of centralized rule and humane conduct, proclaimed through inscriptions carved on rocks, was lost.
It's very rarely that a king expresses himself so fully and so publicly. So that the body of edicts, and the body of edicts grows every 5 or 10 years, more are discovered. I mean, we now have a whole set from Afghanistan in Greek and Aramaic, which are very interesting because he's not talking about Buddhism there. He's talking about Dhamma as a policy of piety and behavior towards each other and so on. He explains the whole thing very nicely in Greek and in Aramaic, which was the language of Iran at that time.
Ashoka remained unknown to modern India till the first decade of the 20th century. The pillars and rocks on which he engraved his inscriptions were often used by later kings for leaving their own marks. Thus, the Girnar rocks on which Ashoka engraved his message were used by Rudradaman and Skandagupta to tell their own tales. In the 14th century, Firoz Shah Tughlaq carefully transported one of the majestic Ashokan pillars from far away to Delhi and had it re-erected in the Kotla, which he named after himself. However, none could tell him about who had had the pillar erected in the first place. Muslim scholars thought mysterious jinns had built them, and Hindu Pandits believed them to be the walking sticks of Bhim of the Mahabharata. Centuries later, the British mint master, James Prinsep, painstakingly went through the inscriptions carved on rocks and pillars. In order to assist him in his researches, the inscriptions were sawn off this pillar which Firoz Shah had re-erected on the Delhi Ridge, and the sawn-off portions were sent to Calcutta. Prinsep did decipher the script and found that the inscriptions were by a king called Devanam Priyadarshi.
Devanam Priyadarshina Lajina Visativa Saviva Sansena Atana Achantamiyate Itabadde Jate Saikamunati
However, even the deciphering of the script did not endow the pillars with any historical sanctity. The one on the Delhi Ridge was used for target practice, and the fragments of another were used as road rollers. It was the discovery of the Maski inscription in Karnataka that referred to the king as Devanam Priyadarshi Ashoka, which finally proved his identity. But such is the historical consciousness of our civilization that even today, the residents of Gotihawa near the Indo-Nepal border continue to worship an Ashokan pillar as a Shivaling.
कर्पूर गौरम कोड़ातार सारम भुजगेंद्र हारम सदाप संतम हृदयारविंदे भवम भवानी सेतु नमामि तमेव माता चाप्ता तमेव बंधुच्चास्का तमेव विद्याधर्म तमेव सर्वम मम देव नमः.
एक साल गांव में आग लग गई, कई झोपड़ियां जल रही थी, सब लोगों ने अपनी झोपड़ियों को बुझाया. उसके बाद यहाँ तो आग सुलग रही थी, तो 3-4 दिनों के बाद में यहाँ बहुत बड़ा विस्फोट हुआ, बहुत जोर से दगने की आवाज आई. लोग देखने के लिए आए तो इसमें पत्थर के टुकड़े निकल गए थे, तो लोगों ने इसको कहा महादेव है जो फूट गया है, इस नाते इसको फुटेश्वर महादेव बाबा करके पूजा करने लगे.
Ashoka may have been lost to memory through the ages, but his idea of displaying imperial glory through majestic pillars remained unchanged. The rust-free iron pillar at Mehroli in Delhi, built a few centuries after the Mauryas, is clearly a replica of an Ashokan column. This pillar also stands testimony to the continuing theme of iron in Indian history, whether for the swords of Ajatashatru, Ashok and Akbar, or for the humble ploughshare. It was iron, that least glamorous but most important of all metals, that provided the steel frame on which civilization was erected. In the 19th century after Christ, Jamshedji Tata pointed to the British the fact that India had adequate supplies of iron to enable it to enter the modern industrial era. However, it was only when cheap American, Belgian and Japanese steel began competing with British steel in India that the Tatars were allowed to set up an iron and steel industry in the first decade of the 20th century, at about the same time that Ashok was being rediscovered. The Tatars were then permitted to build a steel plant located in the tribal village of Sakchi, which became Jamshedpur. The industrial city lies in the heart of the area that Ashok might well have passed through on his way to Kalinga. The transition from iron to steel marked India's entry into a new phase of the Iron Age, and it was perhaps appropriate that the symbols of Ashok, the righteous emperor of the Iron Age, were adopted as the symbols of modern republican India.